So it's
6:02.
a meeting of the Plain Township Zoning Commission, October 11, 2017 is called to order. Mr. Farrar, would you please take a roll call, see who's all here.
Mr. Wolf.
Here.
Mr. Craig. Mr. Seeberger.
Here.
Mr. Renbecker.
Here.
Mr. Crawford.
Here.
Mr. Harrison.
Here. There being a quorum, we'll go to the agenda. It's circulated. Does anybody have any proposed changes to the agenda?
No, Mr. Chairman.
No. I do have one item of business that I was requested by our zoning assistant to address, and that would be under new business or, new business. And it's just a procedural matter dealing with timing and submission of minutes. Just I want to get something on the record about that. So if we could add that to the agenda.
I would move to add the minutes issued to the agenda.
Second.
Moved by Mr. Seeberger, seconded by Mr. Crawford. Any discussion? Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Any other changes to the agenda? Okay, let's go forward. I see that there are no members of the public here today, so I'm going to dispense with the reading of the duties and procedures. We'll go to the minutes for the May 31st, 2017 meeting. You see in our packet that Mr. Rombacher has submitted a one-page, nicely drafted summary of our activity at the May 31st meeting. Do I have a motion to approve the minutes as submitted?
So moved.
And second.
Moved by Mr. Crawford, seconded by Mr. Seeberger. Any discussion? Those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Unanimous. Okay, now go to, there being no unfinished business that I'm aware of, we'll go to the new business, which is Amendment 571-17, dealing with fences, walls, and hedges. You may note, as did I, that originally the public notice included a text amendment proposed to change the transit vendor policy, which it was subsequently discovered and determined that that is a matter of a home rule amendment, not a zoning amendment. And so that matter, by written withdrawal and action of the trustees, was removed from the agenda tonight. So we are dealing only with the text amendment 571-17, dealing with fences, walls, and hedges. The applicant is the Plain Township trustees. And Mr. Farrar, maybe you could start by indicating generally what's going on with this.
The township is, township members are being sued because of the difference of opinion and definition of a hedge and a tree. And the legal, or the attorneys have, the attorneys think that think that we should put definite definitions for those items in the resolution, in the hopes that this might stop the lawsuit. But we need it anyway.
Okay. So are you saying currently our zoning does not contain definitions for fences, walls, and hedges?
Correct.
So how have you been interpreting that as the township zoning
common-
enforcement officer?
The common
Plain meaning?
interpretation,
Okay.
plain meaning.
And for how many years in your experience has that been sufficient?
The last 30 years.
All right. So, so you've submitted, and the township trustees have propose some specific definitions, and we did get an RPC recommendation regarding that, which is also in our packets, and it appears to be a recommendation of approval with a modification to what they believe is a more standard definition of what a tree is. Have you looked at their definition of tree?
I have, sir, and
Would that resolve the issue you're concerned of? Although I see it's not as specific about diameter and height. Are the diameter and height an issue with what you're dealing with right now?
the height is an issue, but I think the intent was to really be specific on trees, so that we could deal with what's going on. So that's the way it was written, that whether you as a board want to utilize that or not, that's up to you. But the intent was to try and be as specific as possible.
The record will reflect that at 6:10, we've been joined thankfully by our other member, Mr. Craig. So is the definition submitted by the zoning commission sufficient in your mind, or is it unsatisfactory in some ways based on what the township trustees were looking for?
It is a bit, I might say, watered down, for lack of a better word, I think that being more specific might be better.
Probably before we go any further, I'll move for purposes of discussion to accept amendment number 571-17 fences, walls, and hedges as submitted by the applicant.
Second.
Discussion. I'm sorry. All those in favor of accepting or approving the motions? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. We are going to discussion.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
He's putting it on the table.
I see it.
Who seconded?
My apologies. Mr. Crawford?
My job.
Mr. Crawford seconded the motion of Mr. Rambacher to approve the amendment, and that we're now in discussion. Okay, so in terms of discussion, we've seen the RPC recommendation. Does everybody have a copy of that?
Yeah.
It looks like their definition of tree
Comes from Merriam's dictionary.
talks about substantial or
Considerable height.
considerable versus a specific measurement of 13 feet or more at maturity. So would a 3-foot tall pine tree that is in the process of growing, that would be expected to be 30 feet in height in 30 years, is that a tree, or is it at some point something less than a tree just because it's not substantial yet?
I would see it as a tree.
Yeah, I would see it as a tree also. I was thinking about, I drove around one of the neighborhoods to see maybe how many people that would impact if you considered some of these barriers or the hedges, if you will. You know, how many people, it looks like it appears to be over 8 feet tall, you know, just for that privacy. It looks like there's a considerable amount of people who let that kind of growth happen, you know. And I have neighbors across the street that have pine trees. I mean, they're tall, they're maturity, they would be considered a tree. But you had just mentioned, you know, if it's not to maturity, is it considered a shrub, and should it be maintained at 8 feet? You know, I think that's a good question.
Where are we falling on it, gentlemen? Are we falling on it as that it doesn't have to be grown to a specific height, as long as at some point it will be expected to reach a height of 13 feet? And by the way, there is a little discrepancy, Tom, in the I'm seeing that in the proposed amendment, it says a height of 13 feet, but in parentheses, it says 13 inches.
Yeah, it does.
Oh, good point.
Is there a difference?
Yeah. Ask the woman.
Well, my initial reaction to this was, aren't trees and shrubs defined biologically? I mean, don't we know what trees are and shrubs are, and apparently not.
I've looked through several, I've looked all through the internet. If you're in England, a hedge could be a row of trees.
Right.
So there really isn't a definite.
Yeah, I found the same thing, and the definition that we've got from the Board of Regional Planning Commission seems to be out of the same thing as Merriam's Dictionary.
Yeah.
So I think the problem is, if, you know, you go to our existing system, which is commonly understood that an oak tree is going to be an oak is a tree, despite its size, how young it might be, it is a tree. And other things are more recognizable as bushes, and then there's this stuff in between. And the proposal tree from the trustees is certainly more specific to deal with the particular problem that the trustees seem to be faced with, and the township seems to be faced with.
Why 13? Why not 10? Why not 8?
Well,
I just,
that's why I said, when I was in
So
Boy Scouts, I
arbitrary.
remember reading something, and a bush is something that grows to a certain height, and trees are bigger. But plenty of trees have more than one trunk. You know, certain species may have 3 trunks, and they're 30 feet high.
What's an arborvitae? Is that a tree or a shrub?
I don't know.
I believe that's a shrub, but it's a very tall one.
It can be a 40-foot tall shrub.
Yeah. So I think it's a height definition is what we're trying to get to.
Well, hedges,
Height at maturity. It doesn't talk about maturity, but I mean, that could be one way of defining it. Commonly,
It says a height of 13 feet or more at maturity.
Right.
What our applicant has submitted, that's not what RPC has.
no, I'm saying RPC doesn't say anything about maturity, which doesn't help us at all. It sort of puts us where we are now, which is it's up to the zoning.
you know, considerable height or some distance from the ground.
So, for clarification, are these definitions the definitions that the trustees approved of, and they want us to incite basically that these are good definitions for reference?
To
basically?
consider them, yes.
Yeah.
The
So they-
applicant has submitted them. It's our job to review them and make a recommendation whether they're suitable, appropriate, or there should be other considerations, or whether we want to modify the definition, and we respond to them, then they have a further public hearing on it before they approve it. It's basically required to have a public meeting about it and have our input.
So we are kind of defining what a hedge, a shrub, a tree, and a wall would be in the township
Right.
from this meeting, okay?
Tom, if we change the regional planning definition to read, instead of growing to a considerable height, if we put has a potential of growing to a height of 13 feet or more at maturity, basically a hybrid of the two definitions, putting your height definition in, but their more general discussion of what a tree is, would that address your concern?
It would to a degree, but when we get to lateral branches some distance above the ground, again, we're in a fog. What is some distance?
Some distance would be 6 inches, 12 inches, 100 feet.
Well, a pine tree grows with branches, they can be right on the ground, the lower ones.
Weeping willow.
And that's why some distance might be an appropriate terminology versus naming a specific distance.
Well, the township, the trustee proposed definition of tree doesn't talk about limbs.
Okay, so would you propose getting rid of the discussion of limbs and talk more about diameter at breast height?
Or definitely
Height.
foliage, a crown, a foliage.
Pine tree doesn't have foliage, does it, or a crown?
Yeah, it's got needles, that's considered a
It's not-
foliage, and they're evergreen, they're not, yeah, they don't fall
It's
off.
definitely formed.
Right. That's what I believe, anyway, I believe the needles on a pine tree would be considered a foliage.
Yeah.
Whatever the green chlorophyll filled systems are on that tree. Well,
Mr. Chairman, I mean, part of me, I realize that this is before us to consider. Part of me feels the words hedge, shrub, tree, and wall have such commonly understood meanings, that we can't improve upon those commonly understood meanings by trying to define them. And to me, that's a possibility that it's hard to define the tree, but I guarantee you, as you drive or walk down the street, each of us could readily distinguish between shrubs and trees and be right and be consistent with each other 100% of the time.
I think one of the things that,
Doesn't that go to the foundation of the problem, that you're trying to enforce a zoning requirement here, but it's unenforceable because they can't define it, and you can't leave it up to the complaint. Seems to be we can't just leave that to the zoning inspector to resolve. Isn't that the problem?
Or we have to leave it to the courts to resolve.
Or leave it to the courts to resolve on a case-by-case basis?
Well, the matter that's before the courts, do they have to go through the Board of Zoning Appeals?
No, it did not. And
Okay,
that was one of the arguments.
it went directly from a decision by you to the Court of Common Pleas,
Yes.
so there's a lack of exhaustion of remedies. And as the zoning
And-
director, I mean, you know what a tree is and you know what a shrub is. And my guess is, that the Board of Zoning Appeals will know, and that the trial court would then defer to you and the Board of Zoning Appeals. And to me, we may be complicating things by trying to define these four terms.
I hate to make a bad analogy, but are we trying to, like, the dilemma of defining pornography? I know it when I see it. A tree, I know it when I see it.
I actually was thinking of that.
And we know where that argument ends up. There does have to be, at some point in time, a court is trying to frame a definition of what we all know, what we see.
Yeah.
So what we're asking, I think, is for Mr. Ferrara to tell us as specifically as he can what it is that he wants to see to call a tree. And were you involved in the preparation of the definition that was submitted by
No,
the
this was
trustee?
done by the attorneys.
The attorneys.
Was this done by Eric Williams?
No.
So,
Who did it?
I'm trying to think of the name, it's escaped me, I've got it in my file.
Whoever's representing the township?
They don't define fence.
Jim Matthews?
Yes.
No. He's a pretty,
The thing that I see happening is is we don't define it. It goes to the appeals. Appeals says absolutely not, a tree is a tree, a hedge is a hedge. Now he goes to court anyway. And we're still back in court again, where if we have a definition, then we have something to stand on when we say no. And we don't have to spend the money for court.
I don't know if it would be retroactively applied anyway, but as
I-
far as future enforcements,
Well, as soon as the court case is done, statutes and, or the ordinance is in place, and you can enforce it then. I mean, you could say this, I mean, just to argue the devil's advocate for a moment, you could also argue, look, anybody can bring a lawsuit anytime over any simple thing. You can't anticipate that there's going to be a flood of cases over what is a tree or a bush. I see that they didn't bother to define fence, which is in the name of the ordinance.
The fence is already in here, in the definitions.
Oh, I'm sorry.
An artificially constructed barrier, usually made of post, wire,
Okay.
wood, or bricks used to enclose or screen areas of land. 2013.
Okay.
Although I would have thought fence.
Would have been common.
Well, that's what I'm thinking, it's pretty, I mean, well, fences you get all the time, and because, you know, they put the restrictions in 3 feet in the front, so people can see across and not build, you know, huge walls and call them a fence in the front of the property. So I mean, like, at least that's something that has got a history. We really have a history of cases arguing about what fences and trees are, or what hedges and shrubs and trees are. I'm just asking, I was unaware of any such.
It's the first one that I know of.
does it matter to you, as an enforcement officer, that a tree is isolated and naturally growing in one place as opposed to a tree line, which may more be in the semblance of a row or a line of closely spaced vegetation? Is that where the mix-up is on this? Is that where his argument is? It's because it's a tree line?
That would probably be correct.
Okay. So the spacing and the row or the nature of the plantings is where he's arguing that this is not just tree, this is a hedge.
Hedge. That's the way it sounds.
What does, say, Jackson Township or the city of North Canton's zoning definitions have? Do they have
I
definitions?
didn't find any.
They're not there. So, in the North Canton, presumably, people will know if the tree is a tree, the wall is a wall.
Do we have anything that we can touch to in terms of, like, for example, when a screening or barrier is required between dissimilar classifications? Do we talk about what's supposed to be planted, trees, shrubs, or whatever, and do we have kind of a definition or understanding there of what's supposed to be done?
Not the particular plants, but it does talk about a fence that, in one sense, would be that you couldn't see through.
Okay, so the idea is a visual buffer,
Yeah.
which could be accomplished by trees or shrubs, depending on the
Both.
nature,
Yes.
depending on the nature of the particular plant.
Right, and it gives a minimum height within a minimum amount of time. Everything should be grown this high so that we provide that buffer. But it doesn't give specific plants.
So is there a why to all this as far as why the trustees thought that they would send this down, that we need definitions now? Is it just because of a complaint? Exactly, maybe I missed that part.
Yeah, there was a response, I mean, Tom and at least one other township official have been named in some sort of litigation by an offended landowner who is trying to get the township to enforce a zoning problem it's having with a neighbor. What he believes is a zoning problem with a neighbor because of vegetation that's growing on their boundary lines.
So, could I just suggest this maybe that if we start playing or adding definitions, that it could create more concerned residents as far as, and you know, maybe it wouldn't be a bad thing, but you know, you drive around and you see the barriers and people have a lot of different shrubs and trees that are over 8 feet tall. Are they gonna have to start maintaining that? Are there gonna be more complaints? Does it ensue like where, you know, kind of like where does the leaf fall? You know, you take care of your leaves that fall in your neighbor's yard kind of thing. Does that make sense?
You don't want to open up a can of worms by trying to correct one small problem, creating a larger one.
Creating a much.
I understand that.
That's what I was trying to get before. This might, again, as a devil's advocate, this might be an overreaction to a single incident. I'm just throwing it out there.
You may be right, and that's probably something that we are considering. Apparently, I would give the trustees the credit for having thought of that also.
Don't disagree.
Not that our judgment should be substituted for them. I think that they have, as required, submitted this to us for our deliberation to maybe look over the details of this and take a further study of it and a look at it from a purely zoning perspective that they maybe are not missing. Maybe they are submitting this to our expertise for that. So let's take it for what it is.
John,
Yes, sir.
just wondered what you were thinking.
Well, in general, I would say this. I think words such as tree, shrub, hedges are generally ascribed the common meaning associated with them, such that by ascribing definitions to them, you are actually limiting, you're being more limiting than you are otherwise. And I think you may be taking a baseball bat to a mosquito by creating a definition.
Sounds like we have an enforcement dilemma. It's isolated. Would this board consider modifying the text to read that the term shall have their common meaning, and where a dispute arises as to the common meaning, defined factors could be considered? Something along that line. And then reference these particular considerations.
Yeah, because if you look at tree, I mean, there are species of trees that get very large that habitually do not have a single trunk.
I have a row of hemlock trees.
Yeah, I mean,
And I maintain those at about 10 feet high as a hedge. Because that species can be, under this definition, that would be a tree.
Well, there are multi-trunk trees as well.
Yeah, I
I'm
understand.
saying, just an example, going the other direction, somebody could say, hey, your shrub is too big, and it must be a shrub because it has 3 trunks instead of a single trunk. And therefore, I need you to chop down that 30-foot black cherry,
Or just take 2 of the trunks off.
or take 2 of the trunks off and chop it down so it's 12 feet high.
And the rest of them will be gone in a couple of years.
I'm just saying, you could see this turned around and used as an offensive weapon as opposed to a shield, given the right set of circumstances.
Well, the property that gives rise to this dispute is bounded on all of its sides by other R1 residential
Yes.
properties.
Yes.
So how do the height of or existence of trees or shrubs impact that property at all?
Is it, apparently, well, there's no apparent problem when I look at it. You've got
What's-
trees
what's he
in
saying
the
about
backyard, and it would seem to me that it's probably a neighborhood dispute. Maybe leaves are dropping in the yard and he doesn't want to clean them up.
I don't see anything in our code that
That's,
addresses,
that's civil action.
I don't see anything in our code that addresses
No.
that issue at all.
Uh-uh.
And I kind of concur with John, hedge, shrub, tree, and wall, and commonly understood meanings. And courts, are very commonly will adopt and use those commonly understood meanings, or go to, like the Webster Dictionary.
I'm looking at the resolution of trustees. The board believes that the words wall, hedge, for purposes of, are clearly understood and applied when using the plain and ordinary meaning of these words.
Right.
But then the next paragraph, they're saying that the inclusion of specific definitions may nevertheless aid in the application of the zoning resolution. While I respect that, I disagree. I think you're actually going the other way.
Yeah, I do too.
Well, to give the trustees the benefit of the doubt, I like Steve's idea of saying it, hey, they're given their generally recognized their plain meaning. And if the zoning inspector wants to, or needs a little more direction, he can consider these other factors. That might, it's the only compromise I can think of that I'm comfortable with.
I wouldn't even want to go that far.
Well, here's something.
Go ahead.
It says, the maximum height of a fence, wall, or hedge in any residential district shall be 8 feet. Where he was saying that he keeps his trees as like a hedges at 10 feet. So would that be considered a zoning violation, being that it's over 8 feet, or is it considered a tree?
Being a landowner, I would tell you it's a tree.
Well, and the definition of hedge.
A row of trees.
Talks about
That's a
shrubs.
tree.
So I guess that's where the situation is coming into play. You use them as a hedge, but they are a tree. And so it's the determining factor of, if it's a hedge, if you're using it as a hedge, it's gotta be 8 feet or less. But if you're keeping it at 10 feet, then it's a tree.
I mean, look, if this, are all we talking about is that you have to keep a hedge 5 feet from any street right-of-way line.
Out front, yes.
How about a tree
Versus
versus
trees, I'm not aware of any similar 5 foot or otherwise distance requirement from the
Well,
right-of-way line.
On a tree, it talks about not blocking the view
Right.
for corner lots. So would that follow through for it and just trim it up higher?
Yeah, you see that all the time.
And if the tree is growing out into the right of way, then it's gonna interfere with the road department and its snowplow maybe, or,
I just struggle with someone telling me that the words are clearly understood, using plain and ordinary meanings of those words, but then saying that it would be of assistance nonetheless if you have specific definitions.
John, and this suggested by their counsel who are involved in a trial over that very issue, and they don't want to be inconsistent. I mean, who knows why they put that in there? I mean, I agree with it, but they may have their other motives that we're not privy to.
That's a bad law.
I agree.
So do you face this issue so often that you feel compelled to really lock yourself into definitions? Now I'm aware of trees that don't get to 13 feet at maturity.
I mean, I
Are
think
they
some
not-
of the words that stick out
Are they
to
not at
me
that point of truth?
are, like when John says, you know, this would be more of a civil action case. Earlier, somebody said this would be an overreaction, perhaps. And Tom, you said this is kind of like an isolated, you don't get a lot of this. So, I mean, for us to change this whole section, 60210, to me, it doesn't make a lot of sense to do something like that, to add these definitions. And none of us seem to be super proficient in the terminology in the horticulture that revolves around tree, shrub, and hedges, you know?
I'm not an arborist.
Not an arborist.
Gentlemen, we have several options. We can call the issue and vote it up or down. We can choose to make amendments or modifications to the applicant's submitted text and vote on that. We can table it. Any more discussion?
There is a pending motion with respect to the proposed, the modification proposed by the trustees.
There being no apparently further discussion, I'm going to call the issue.
Well, unless someone wants to amend, move to amend it.
Now, let's get a vote on it and then see where that leads us. If it passes, we're done. If it doesn't pass, we move on.
Mr. Craig,
No.
Mr. Seibert,
No.
Mr. Rombeck,
No.
Mr. Croft,
No,
and Mr. Harris.
Yes.
Carries. I'm kidding.
Actually fails.
No, I know. I'm just
Let the record show that the amendment failed 4-1. Is there any further business in relation to that proposed amendment?
No, Mr. Chairman, I will throw up one possibility, and it's based in part on the comments from the two non-attorneys. I would move that one definition be added, and that definition be the submitted definition for hedge, which reads a row or line of closely spaced shrubs planted and trained in such a way as to form a barrier, screen, or fence, or to mark the boundary of an area.
second.
Point of order, I don't know, I mean, you don't have an application for that. Do we have anything in front of us on that?
Well, we have an application, or an application to amend the text as submitted.
And
We have the option to modify it or approve it with modification, to approve it as submitted, to outright deny it, or we can table it.
I understand that, but we just outright denied it, and so we really have nothing before the board to act on at this point, in my view.
Well, if our
We can
my
make a
fellow member-
recommendation.
If my fellow member, Mr. Seaver, wants to make a motion, and he has and already seconded it, I'm gonna accept the motion and the second. And if we're found to be out of line in doing any action on that, then I'd rather we be told about that subsequently. Your objection or procedural question is no.
And Mr. Chairman, the reason for my proposing a single definition is so that it is clear that a hedge does not consist of a line of trees, or what are arguably trees.
You're differentiating a tree line as not a hedge.
Yes, because it says shrubs.
Okay, we're in discussion now, okay, just so we all are aware, we're in discussion of this new motion to approve a definition of a hedge. And by the way, we could initiate action if procedurally this is not appropriate to view it as an amended, or as an approved amendment. We as a board can initiate the action of creating a definition.
Without advertisement, without notice?
No, we can propose that, it would have to be re-advertised, and then we'd have a public hearing on that.
I understand that.
Yeah.
So that's what I was saying earlier, I think we can make a suggestion or recommendation, as it were, but I'm not sure we can do anything legislatively.
Not tonight as a conclusive matter.
Right.
Okay. Maybe we agree. Okay. But there's a motion and a second.
You make the rules.
We're now in discussion on
So,
to approve, to adopt a definition of hedge as submitted by the trustees in their amendment 57117, which we rejected, or which we denied. Okay, and is there some, just any other member have any comment or discussion they want to make about that definition or that pending motion?
I suppose I'm just sorry Terry didn't do it, make a suggestion before we moved on the original motion. I kind of like the idea of defining hedge now that he pointed it out, but I recognize the procedural issue as well.
so my question is, oh, I'm sorry.
I'm just gonna say, it doesn't say anything about trees, it's closely spaced shrubs. Nothing about trees by definition.
Exactly.
But then you gotta define shrubs.
No, if we're going with our general proposition that it's commonly, these are commonly understood, really what we're focusing on is the true, perhaps what we might be focusing on, I get the impression we're focusing on, the true nature of this guy's complaint about these row of trees being a hedge that needs to be controlled. And by defining hedge as being a shrub, we may be shifting the argument, but I mean, as we said, in England, a hedge could be a row of trees. So it's a little more, it's a little less well-known word than a shrub or a tree. If I'm misstating your point, Terry, please.
You understand the point. Let's face it, practically speaking, if you walk through the neighborhoods of Plain Township, I mean, arguably there are thousands of violations of 602.10, so hopefully nobody's looking.
Well, my biggest point is, with hedge, a row
Including
of
in my own yard,
minor
probably.
closely spaced shrubs. So would that mean, for instance, John's trees, would that be considered a hedge? Since he's using them as a hedge or as a barrier? Or would it still be
If they're
considered?
trees, then it doesn't matter if they're in a line. They wouldn't be considered a hedge under the definition here.
I just looked up shrubs, and it came up with a hedge is a wall composed of plants. Some are purely decorative, while others serve primarily a practical function. Hedges used decoratively are often trimmed to precise sizes, shapes, and include evergreen and deciduous shrubs.
So in his case, if he's using them as a barrier or a wall with a row of trees, it still, by definition, would be, a row of plants. Especially if it has multi-trunks.
But if it says, if hedge is defined as a row or line of closely spaced shrubs,
That's why they're trying to look for the definition of shrub.
trees would not be shrubs.
It appears that gentleman is why we are struggling with this, because some of us apparently think that a shrub and a tree are mutually exclusive, where others are offering that some trees can be grown as shrubs that till they reach a certain height, are shrubs or part of a hedge, and then become trees as they get taller.
Well,
I will say that nobody's gonna hurt my feelings if they vote no on my motion.
No, all I'm saying is, my perception is that we're really pointing out the dilemma.
right, because like when John was talking, you know, he knows that it's a row of trees, but he uses them as a hedge.
Now,
And he keeps them at 10 feet.
as a former landscaper, we would identify a tree line or a row of plants that had a hedge line, not because it was distinguished from a tree or a shrub, but simply because it was a line.
Uniform
Yeah,
height.
uniform height,
Right.
yeah, so,
Does that sound good?
So that's why we need a definition of shrub and a tree in order to get the definition of the hedge.
I mean, it sounds like a simple thing and it should be common, but obviously it's not common even to us. As we talk this out a little bit more, and it's just hard to me, it's hard to define, make definitions or approve these definitions, which we've already said that we're not gonna do. But even just putting in the definition of hedge, I feel like you could still, somebody could argue that there's a hedge line, and it could be a hedge line made up of trees, of something that would fall under the category or definition of a tree. So we would have to have multiple definitions in there, and not just a hedge definition.
Could we call the question on hedge?
Sure. I think that I shall see the end of this question. We will answer it here with a vote.
Okay.
So we'll call the motion of Mr. Seeberger and seconded by Mr. Crawford to adopt the definition of a hedge as a row or line of closely spaced shrubs planted and trained in such a way as to form a barrier, comma, screen or fence, comma, or to mark the boundary of an area. All those in favor signify by saying, I'm sorry, let's call it by roll, please.
Mr. Craig,
No.
Mr. Seaver,
Yes?
Mr. Rumbacker. Rumbacker, I'm sorry.
It's okay, no.
Mr. Crawford,
No.
Mr. Harris,
No. That also failed 4-1, I think. Okay. All right. Are there any other matters of new business before we go to the additional item of procedural matters related to minutes?
Not from me, I think that we did a good job of discussing this.
Did the board want to put something in writing to pass on to the trustees? As to why the decision was reached?
I think our minutes
They can
will
better
eventually
Okay, we can.
summarize the
Okay.
concerns we had.
We can use the minutes.
And if they watch the tape, then they'll know instantly.
Okay, so since I kind of suggested adding it to the agenda, I'm going to open by reporting that a few days ago, I had received a telephone call from our zoning assistant indicating that she had not received the minutes from the May 31st, 2017 meeting, and that there was a time limit that they were to have been submitted, and I believe she mentioned something like 90 days. Might have been
No, it's 30 days.
differently, I'm sorry, 30 days, but there was a problem if they were later than 90 days. Anyway, I inquired as to what the issue was because I knew we had approved the proposed text changes dealing with cellular towers and rights-of-way. And we had spent an awful lot of time on that. And it was actually the second meeting on that issue having been previously tabled. And that we had notified the trustees of our approval of that. And I think that action had been taken based on our submission or our passing of that resolution. And so I wondered what the problem was. Well, it seemed that the problem was that the person I was talking with wanted to have the minutes and didn't have them. So I politely explained that typically we review the minutes and approve them at the next meeting, and that we had not had a meeting since then. And so that my expectation would be that the minutes would be provided to her after we approved them. And in fairness, I think she was wanting to do what she perceived to be her job, or that was to make sure these minutes got posted some way so that they could be publicly examined, and that the contemporaneous preparation of minutes lended to the credibility of those minutes, and so that we should be considering making sure that they be submitted closely to when the action was taken, as opposed to waiting a long period of time to get them submitted. And she suggested actually that if it was going to be a long time till they got approved, that her idea would be that it would be a better course for us to have more frequent meetings so that we could make sure and have the minutes done in a timely way. Or that we could go ahead and submit the minutes as unapproved but pending, so she could at least have something to post or whatever it was that she was thinking she needed to do within a certain period of time. It all sounded well-intended, like someone who was diligently following up with something that they felt that they were required to do in a certain time frame. I wasn't able to corroborate while I was talking to her on the phone whether this 30 or 90-day issue was something that was actual or perceived, or where it was even coming from. But she asked that we address it at the meeting, and I said, I'd be glad to bring it up at the meeting. So I did. Here we are. What, if anything, do you want to do about it?
Question,
Yeah.
is there authority for us to act or approve minutes electronically?
Don't know.
I don't,
I don't believe so.
It's not a public meeting.
Well, that's what I'm saying, I don't think that, the easy thing would be to submit it to the board and have an electronic meeting, but I don't think there are provisions for such a process. You know, I guess we might do that for a private corporation or something, but I'm not aware of any sort of thing for a public entity, just administratively to keep the minutes moving forward, as opposed to having any other meeting that way. I'm not aware of that. I'm asking if it's something, if I'm missing something.
yeah, I don't think we could do that.
Okay,
I'm looking
that's
at,
the easy way out, gone.
yeah, I'm looking at 50912, and 50912 talks about the recommendation from the zoning commission. It doesn't say that whether the recommendation has to be reduced to writing or not.
And that's what I was gonna say, that this body can make a recommendation without having that recommendation memorialized within the minutes, whether the minutes are approved or otherwise.
And we do that.
And we do that.
We have a separate, in fact, there's one in our packet that basically allows us to, at the end of this meeting, be able to report immediately whether we've approved or denied an applicant.
Right.
So there may be some confusion over what is required when. I think everybody's going forward with this, at least from the input of the zoning assistant. I think she was honestly inquiring and trying to meet what she perceived to be a duty and didn't want us to run afoul of that. I think the idea of having minutes available almost contemporaneously or as close to within a month of when the meeting was had is a good idea, but it isn't necessarily an obligation. Do we want to address that in any way and, for example, establish as a policy that we will try to circulate, where feasible, proposed minutes at a certain time after meeting, even though we may not be going to approve them till the following meeting, so that we can at least be talking about it if we need to, or getting a chance to review it for ourselves while it's still current in our mind.
Can I say one thing?
Sure.
I apologize, I'm not familiar with what's going on. I
You were
came
off.
back
You
from
came
vacation,
back.
And Vicki was gone. I do know that there has been frustration in the past when it comes time to getting materials in a timely manner for an upcoming meeting to air. And that includes the minutes from prior meetings. I don't know that there is a 30 or 90 day little time limit for that. I've never seen it or heard. So just, there has been some frustration on her part. I know based just on getting the materials to you.
And, you know,
That's really all I know about.
Part of that frustration is as a result of the township not paying to have her here to do it herself. I mean, what happens is that John is in the position of having to deliberate, discuss, and keep minutes, not an easy task.
Let me ask a question. Do you share your minutes with her in advance so that she can, I mean, I'm assuming that that's the case because we got a copy in our packet.
Yeah, I do actually.
Yeah, I mean, that, the other point I want to make
When
is,
they're ready, when they're drafted, I do send those to her.
And the tape is available.
the tape, I mean, it's posted, I think, fairly quickly as well. So I don't know that there's really a problem here, other than it'd be good practice if we met on a monthly basis and took care of all these things in a timely fashion, but that might be, a lot of it would be expensive, and we wouldn't be having meetings just to approve minutes.
Just for 5
It'd
minutes.
probably be cheaper to keep her here.
Yeah.
Her doing
Well,
5 minutes.
I want to make an observation too. First of all, thank you, John, for being the secretary. 'Cause I've been there, and I know that we can't necessarily delegate to a non-board member the precise interpretation, even with the nuances, and summarily reporting what we're doing here. You can look at a tape, and we all know what happened here. And I'm thinking a third party, even if she were sitting here, could give a good idea, but it's incumbent upon our officer, our secretary, our board secretary, to review that and ultimately submit what this body believes to be the report of what happened in our meeting. And the clerical assistance of a person being here provided by the township was and is appreciated, but it isn't the end all. We still have to have people like John, people like me in the past. I'm sure Mr. Crawford did it for a while. He knows what that means, and it is very hard to deliberate, pay attention to what's going on, and try to keep track of all that what's going on. And I know, and John has reported that he goes back and looks at the tape because he wants to be thorough with that and get not only the memory of his perception of what was happening here, but also a second look at it to pick up on some of the things that he maybe has missed or whatever, or to refresh his recollection again, to be thorough. So I don't want to minimize the importance of good minutes, nor do I want to put any undue pressure or demands on somebody who's really doing more than the rest of us by taking on the duty as secretary. So thank you, John. Thank you, everybody else who's been secretary. And I only brought this up not because I believe it's a problem, but because it has been raised, and to determine whether this body wants to do anything, if anything, about the concern that was raised.
Well, they're not our minutes until we vote on and approve them. If we're not going to have special meetings just to do that, I don't know what else we could do.
Okay, well, I might suggest, and I would entertain an amendment or a motion to respond to the zoning department and the assistant in particular that we're aware of the concern, that reasonable efforts will be made to provide appropriate minute summaries as expeditiously as feasible based on everything else that's going on with the secretary's demands, or demands upon the secretary, and that if there are specific instances of concern or time limits that we are not meeting, that we'd like, that we would request you would contact the chairman immediately about any concerns.
I don't even know that a motion is needed. I think, Tom, you just tell her what you just said.
Okay, so if there's no second, I'm gonna ask that Tom do that. Or ask her to look at the minutes, or the tape, rather.
Would it be possible to try and hit a middle ground? I know that she has been told that those minutes have to be entered along with the video on the website.
Oh,
And I just.
is that by policy of the trustees, or is that
They're
by?
unapproved minutes.
They're
But
meaningless.
they would be unapproved.
They're meaningless, and actually misleading, I would suggest.
I would agree,
All right.
as far as I'm
That's what I'm
concerned.
saying, they're not even
All we,
minutes.
all we need then, because those are unapproved, is to get them to the office some weeks before the next meeting, so that you guys can have.
I think the issue is a mechanical one, is my sense, is that she would like to get the whole package out together, including the proposed minutes.
Sure.
I get that.
Sure.
You know, and I'll try to accommodate that, that's all I can suggest to you. I don't know when we get the packages anyway, but.
Get them at least a couple of weeks before the meeting,
So
2
she,
to 3 weeks.
so she would be posting the proposed minutes, not.
No, no, no,
Part of your-
no, no.
part of your
No.
package would be,
Yeah,
is usually the proposed
Oh.
minutes.
yeah, but it's mailed to you.
I would not favor putting minutes on the website until they have been approved.
I agree.
Okay.
And I'd be comfortable with a direct communication by email or otherwise from the secretary to us as board members in a reasonable short period of time before the meeting at which they are proposed to be approved, so that Vicki doesn't have to hold up a package.
So it's not on her back.
Yeah.
You know, I get that.
Well, honestly, when I was secretary, this happened at one point in time when there was a gap, and I just tried to get them done as quickly as possible to avoid that issue. And sometimes, hopefully, it was better after that issue came up.
I would hate to see a meeting just for the 10 minutes it would take it would take longer to conduct the beginning
Right.
of the meeting than it would be to finish
I
it.
don't want to do that. As I said, I'll endeavor to get, you know, to have those ready in a quicker manner.
And I don't want.
So she can do her job. You know, I want her to be able to do her job.
Spoiling.
But you've got a job to do too.
You realize that was the next day.
But I understand where she's coming
Okay.
from, so, and that's fine. I don't take offense.
And I, for one, am very, very satisfied and complimenting the efforts of the individuals on this board for each and every role you're doing and doing well. So please don't take it as a criticism. Okay. I think we've addressed that sufficiently. Unless anybody else has any other business, I'd entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Discussion? Go Tribe? Is their plan? I don't
Yes.
know if they're rained out or not, but, okay. All those in favor of adjourning signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay.
I should have put that on, just so.